is Edna?
I don't have a clue.
Please.
I did not do anything to Edna except drop her off at home.
That's not you on the 27th?
I don't think so.
That's not you? Ringing a bell? Oh look, they're walking around the car. You wiped the entire car down.
I didn't do anything to Edna.
It's not making sense. So you're the last person to be in a vehicle you wiped out of a lady that's missing.
That sounds really up.
I got advised by dispatch that they needed me for a welfare check for Miss Edna Suttles. I arrive on scene, and friends of Miss Edna are standing there. They're worried about her and that Miss Edna didn't show up to work and that Miss Edna's not coming to the door.
There's no signs of any kind of home breaking or disturbance or anything like that. But her vehicle was missing.
The son walked through the house and saw that there were a couple things out of place. Her bed was unmade, which was extremely uncharacteristic of her.
Her shades were up. According to her son, she never would have left her shades up during the night.
He also informed me that she had about $50,000 worth of jewelry that was missing. That's a potential armed robbery on site. At that point, I'm realizing that this is not a welfare check anymore. This is a missing person. Something is not right.
By this time, we had sent out a bolo for the 80-year-old woman, Edna Suttles, and a picture of her vehicle.
After she went missing, she had no phone activity, no social media activity. She just vanished. Her and her vehicle was gone. I was starting to fear the worst.
While on routine patrol, Edna's vehicle was found just outside of a hotel in Travelers Rest. We check with the hotel clerk, and Edna's not a guest. That's definitely odd. Backtracking the surveillance footage, we're able to see Edna's vehicle arrive that morning at the grocery store parking lot. And we see this man, and it was obvious that they knew each other. They waved to each other, and we have no idea who he is. He walks over to his car, gets a small bag, and gets into the front of the Grand Cherokee with Edna, and they drive off. That afternoon, you see Edna's Grand Cherokee back to the grocery store parking lot, almost out of view of the camera. The subject walks all the way back to the front of the parking lot, gets into his car, and brings it right alongside the Grand Cherokee. And it's apparent that he's moving something from the Cherokee to the sedan. He then gets into the Cherokee, drives that to go across the shopping center.
Investigators later observed a white male arriving in Miss Suttles' Jeep and backing it in a spot behind the hotel, and then wipes the vehicle down. the hood, the doors, the windows, the handles. And then he leaves, walks away from the vehicle. A short time later, like within seconds, returns and starts wiping down the hatchback, the inside of the door handles and everything that was touched. This was a game changer. Miss Suttles is probably in danger.
Normal people don't wipe down a vehicle like that unless they're trying to conceal their identity because they just did something criminal. Then quickly walks back to the car, gets in, and proceeds on 25 North out of Traveler's Rest. This has escalated from a standard missing persons case to now a kidnapping and/or homicide. Now we need to figure out who this guy is, where he came from, and where he went. And most importantly, where's Edna?
My mother, she had no fear about anything. She was the first female bail bondsman in the state of South Carolina. She was every bit of 5'0" She was the spunkiest little lady you'd probably ever meet.
She liked to be seen. She had just rooms of clothes. When she walked in the room, she took the room. And she was just amazing.
She loved helping people when she could. Later on in life, she was taking care of other people with dementia and Alzheimer's. She'd be taking care of people that were younger than her. She was just a good-hearted person. She was full of life.
I was praying that she would be found. Just let me know something. Let us find her. Don't let her be gone. Not like this.
Around 9 or 9:30, the white male had went inside the grocery store and purchased a 4-pack of yogurt where he paid cash for. But when he purchased the yogurt, he scanned his supermarket discount card.
We were able to get the information for that value card back from the grocery store. And that let us know exactly who it was. It was Daniel Prince out of Bostic, North Carolina.
I ran a criminal history track on him and found out he had a pretty scary criminal history, including kidnapping, where he served approximately 13 years in Michigan for kidnapping a young lady in the 90s. Knowing what we know about Prince and not knowing anything about where Miss Suttles is, time was of the essence.
This isn't the type of guy that you ask to voluntarily come down to the station to have a chat with us. So what we decided to do is issue an arrest warrant for grand larceny for stealing her vehicle, essentially. Our own fugitive warrants team, they coordinated with the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office in North Carolina, and early in the morning they found him outside his home in the silver sedan.
This window, somebody's window.
And they took him into custody without any issue.
Totally cooperating, just relax. Not doing anything, but not cooperating. All right, listen, we good? Stand up on your feet. Yeah. Walking him back. That's my wife. She's not going to do anything.
Take care of it. Yeah,
My job is to find the truth about what happened to Edna.
Hey, Greg, pleasure.
At this point, we still don't know whether Edna's alive or dead. Every second counts.
Edna was just a loving, giving person. My mother loved butterflies. And when my mother passed, And I said, I want you to have this. And said, you'll think of your mother. And it was just the most beautiful blanket that had butterflies on it. That was just the kind of friend she was. The moment I heard she was missing, I jumped in the car. I looked for her everywhere for days, just hoping this nightmare would end.
You guys have COVID?
No.
Can I
Do you have COVID?
No.
Okay.
No, not to the best of my knowledge.
Daniel Prince had a criminal history. He's been around the block. He knows the system. But we knew we had to act fast and start asking tough questions.
Okay. Why am I here?
All right. I'll talk to you about August 27th, 2021 of this year. Do you remember where you were at?
Not specifically.
Where do you think you were at?
I've been going all over the place. I've been back and forth to Charlotte. I've been down to South Carolina. I do a lot of home remodeling, home repairs.
Where's your jobs in South Carolina taking you?
Actually, I was down to Traveler's Rest, but I don't know if it was Friday or Thursday. I know I'd been there earlier that week.
Okay. What kind of job were you working on?
I wasn't.
You wasn't?
I wasn't. This lady had talked to me several times. I'd been down to her house 2 or 3 times. We kind of got to be friends.
So it's 3 or 4 times you've been down there?
Yeah, 3 times.
She's never given you work?
No.
Okay, so specifically the 27th.
I think I was down there on the 24th.
So
Why
what
are we...
What you're telling us is that's not you on the 27th? Food Line parking lot?
I don't think so.
That's not you.
That's me. Where's that?
Food Line, August 27th, 2021, 9:23.
Okay.
32 seconds. Ringing a bell?
Yep. Yeah, I went down to Food Line. Okay.
Here's y'all in the hotel parking lot.
Okay.
Yeah? Oh, look, you're walking around the car.
Yeah.
You wiped the entire car down.
Because I was worried.
You were worried. There's you getting back into your car and driving away. Look, man. Where's that?
I don't have a clue.
We need to know. Listen, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
Where is Ed?
I don't have a clue.
Dan? Dan, please. Her family is desperately looking for her.
She's missing right now.
Yes, Dan. Where is Ed?
I don't have a clue.
Yes,
I dropped her off at her house.
Dan, please listen. You did not drop her off at her house. You know what?
When I got, okay, I can help you here.
Okay.
Yeah, give me a second. You got to let me answer the questions when they're asked. She said she wanted me to take her and drive around in my vehicle. So I left her vehicle. I went down to Food Lion, and she was in my vehicle with me. And I dropped her off at home.
His story wasn't believable by any means. Why didn't you just go to her house? Why did you drive her car back and then ditch it in the hotel parking lot? It was essentially like pulling teeth.
Your last one with her, we got you on video.
I'm not denying I was with her.
So,
Okay. You think, this is what I want to see what you're thinking here. You think that someplace from Food Lion to her house, this lady disappeared?
yeah, we know that. I mean, she disappeared between her house.
I dropped her off at her house. I dropped her off at her house because she said her daughter was coming up.
It's not making sense of it. I mean, you're the last person to be in a vehicle you wiped out of a lady that's missing.
That sounds really up.
It does. It does. That's why we're here.
I took her home. I dropped her off and I left. Okay. Cool, Dan. Park. Yeah, I don't look. I'm in the middle of this. I got this old lady with me.
Let's go back to why you wiped the car down.
The only thing I did was because I knew I'd been in and out of her car all the time with her. I'm like, there is no way in hell I'm going to just leave this thing here. And I wasn't going to have part of me on that vehicle. And that's it. People do strange, weird I got a real bad past from a long time ago. And unfortunately, my past from a long time ago, a kidnapping, probably makes this look really stupid. But that's not me, dude.
Really.
I didn't.
That's what we're saying, man.
I didn't do anything bad enough. I did not do anything to Edna except drop her off at home.
It was apparent that Prince wasn't going to give up her location. The more you pressed him, the more he pushed back. It's obvious that he knows a lot more about what's going on than what he's willing to tell us. So what we decided to do is to end this conversation. We need to gain more evidence, come back and re-interview him.
What are you actually charging me with?
It's grand larceny.
Grand larceny.
Okay.
That's where we're at right now.
Okay. So I can bond out and go home?
Possibility.
Okay.
Possibility.
You're not charging me with anything other than grand larceny?
Not right now. That's where we're at.
You seem very, very relieved this is grand larceny.
Because you're talking to me about a missing person.
And not murder or kidnapping.
Yeah. Okay, if somebody was questioning you, saying that someone's missing and that you're the last person that saw them, wouldn't you be relieved that they didn't think you kidnapped or killed somebody?
Well, I'll let you know if I'm ever in that chair. You done?
Yeah, let's see if we can get our paperwork. Let's see. Yes.
At this point, we're concerned. He could potentially get out on bond, and he can go on the run. He can go destroy evidence if he were to get out. Time is of the utmost urgency. When we got out there, we found a number of weapons, handguns, rifles, shotguns, a couple of them with obliterated serial numbers. He had a small arsenal. That's when we contacted the FBI. This is rapidly becoming a very big case.
He immediately was charged for weapons violations due to his criminal history. He's prohibited from possessing firearms.
Now, we have another card to play, and we're finding things that's probably going to keep him in jail for a while. While we're going through his belongings, I discover a credit card to a Nancy Rago and other personal items with her name on it. It seemed that Prince made himself the power of attorney for this lady.
Nancy Rago is not his wife. Now we have this new name, Nancy Rago. And who is she?
We found that she had told people that she was going to go live with Mr. Prince, and they were going to live off the grid and move away together. And we found out that the family had not directly spoken to her in quite some time.
Further investigation revealed Ms. Ragos hadn't been seen since 2017, for 4 years.
We were able to see her Social Security be deposited into her accounts, and the very next day, almost to the dime, that money coming out of the accounts at an ATM near where we knew Prince to reside. This unfortunately looks like it's potentially another victim.
Nancy Ann's first love was the beach. I remember in summertime, she would come and we would go to the lake and go water skiing and go down to Myrtle Beach. My brother-in-law was pulling us behind his boat. Loved the water, even as a child.
Nancy Ann was effervescent. She was the life of the party. Every holiday, after the meal was finished, the men of the family would move the dining room table and create a dance floor. Nancy Ann would cheer for all of us and dance. Her laugh was infectious.
Nancy Ann, say hey, baby.
One of the things that was recovered was a cell phone for Dolores Sellers, who I learned was Nancy Rigo's mother. Dolores Sellers passed away within weeks of Nancy Rigo's disappearance. We began to suspect there was something nefarious with that as well.
Now we have 2 missing people, possibly more. The stakes are even higher. Are they alive? We want to answer that question first and foremost.
Hey, sir, how are you? Good.
We thought that he probably would respond to being interviewed by the FBI.
Hey, I'm Nick. FBI? Yes, sir. Okay. Special agent destination with the FBI. You're welcome.
In a way that kind of helps bolster his ego a little bit. And anytime you build up a man's ego, you're on the right track to get more information than you probably would otherwise.
Well, thanks.
You want some water as we talk?
Are 99% water, 10% or 1% true serum?
I wish we had that, right? Are you okay to talk with us, or at least get started and have a conversation with us?
I'm okay to see where this is going.
Okay, that's fair enough. I'm primarily in South Carolina. So what I know there is they're trying to locate a missing lady there. So what I'd love to do is just ask you about that and kind of get the details. And
why would the FBI be interested in that?
Because I've found out a little bit about this case and it's piqued my interest. And then I found out about you and it piqued my interest even more. Part of this is helpful just to get ahead in this frame of mind.
Yeah, there's something you guys are fishing for here. I've been 13 and a half years in prison. You learn how to read people very well. And I know that you're fishing for something. I know that. That's why you're here. The old saying, the interview doesn't start till the first lie happens.
Well,
That was a little bit of a balancing act of trying to get more information without couching the question in a way that would sound accusatory. At the point where he felt like I was pushing or that I was being disrespectful, I do think he would have then probably would have terminated our interview.
How many times did you see her in August? Was it more than one, you think? How many times do you think you were able to actually go visit her? If you had to estimate, like you said, you went more than one time down there, what would your guess be?
Okay.
In August.
All right. If you keep doing this, okay, I've given you the answer 3 or 4 times, and this is what I know about your line of work. You're going to keep asking me the same thing over and over and over in hopes that something changes. It's not going to change, man.
No, I can promise you that's not what I'm doing.
I have no problem talking to you. What I have a problem with is when it becomes more of an interrogation than a talk. If I'm being interrogated, I need my attorney with me. I have zero thought in my mind that you are anything close to an idiot. Okay, so when I told you 3 or 4 times, I'm 100% certain you remember that.
If I made you feel like you're interrogated, I apologize.
For him, being treated like that was something that was beneath him. It made him feel more like he was a subject rather than maybe a peer that we were working with together. Our goal was to try to have an atmosphere where he felt that we weren't necessarily on opposite sides from him, but that we were kind of shoulder to shoulder as we were walking through this investigation.
So I'll just kind of talk to you about some of the facts of the case, and you help me figure out, say, okay, Justin, here's why this isn't important or this is important, and I'll lay some of it out to you.
Go ahead.
I think that you had I think you had a bank card for somebody that wasn't...
Nancy Sellers Rigo?
That's it, yeah. Tell me about that.
I am her legal power of attorney.
Okay.
She lives between 2 or 3 different places, and she went on the run to live with her boyfriend, Dan. And she basically doesn't want to have anything where somebody could track her through her banking stuff. So I send her gold coins or money that she can get rid of. In fact, I have a letter from her that if anybody ever wants it, will give it to my attorney, for my attorney to give it to people, that lays out in her own handwriting exactly what this arrangement is. But I don't see any reason for anybody to have that at this point in time, because we're not looking for her. She's not missing, literally. There's no big deal there. I'm starting to believe you don't think I'm telling you the truth.
Well, I'm not trying to accuse you of anything.
How do I seem to you? I mean, don't I seem like I want to talk to you? And
you do. Yeah, and I'm appreciative of that.
That's not usually how people are, I would imagine, if they're trying to hide something.
I think that he had created such a crazy tale of everything that happened. Now wasn't the time to really challenge all of those facts, because I wanted to have a relationship with him where I could talk to him again.
I get the feeling from you a little bit that there's, not that you're hiding something, but that there's a whole lot to you that I don't get. I do think you've got a pretty interesting story, and I'm not 100% sure what all that is, but if you want that story told by the Bureau, like, I'm probably the guy to do that for you.
I'm not really that worried about this.
Are you okay if I were to not try to talk about the same stuff over and over again, but if I get some new piece of information that you may get help,
I am more than willing to talk to you anytime you want to talk to me.
Appreciate that.
Even if I find out that I'm released from here, I will make myself available to you.
Thank you.
It was probably the best thing to just terminate the interview at that point. And as long as he felt like I was being fair, he would talk to me. And so we set out to gather the evidence we needed in order to prove that he was responsible for the death of at least 2 women, and then go speak to Mr. Prince again. There was garages and buildings stacked from floor to ceiling, and they found some jewelry that belonged to Edna on the property of Mr. Prince.
Then a B-box was located, set a little bit back away from the house. And when they looked inside the B-box, they found Edna's car keys. And also they found the yogurt cup. The yogurt we knew he purchased at the grocery store. Outside the B-box, we were able to locate her purse, which had her medication in it, her checkbook in it. Also, Edna's shoes were found there, zip ties, cabling, plastic bags were found there. A tarp, a pickaxe, a shovel was found at that location. I think this is the moment that we knew Edna was not coming home alive.
We were looking through a phone, and we see some family members start to check in on this person. And there was one family member in particular who had kept reaching out. We were worried about you, let us know you're okay. And we made the decision kind of on the spot, let's just call them. I identified myself. I told them that I was working a missing persons case in South Carolina, and that we had a device that we believed belonged to their family member. They said they had not heard or spoken from that person in several years. That person's name was Miss Lee Goodman.
From our understanding of talking to her family, Miss Goodman was absolutely loved and adored by her family. She was energetic, She was an occupational therapist, and she was missed. We also then found, going through her financial records, Daniel Prince was using her finances. We realized this is the same pattern we saw with Ms. Rigo.
We realized that Daniel Prince has potentially more victims out there. This guy is an actual serial killer.
Based off my interactions with Mr. Prince, we felt like we had now a good footing to go speak to him again about some of the new evidence that we discovered. Basically present a fact and then ask him to explain it.
I remember you.
Yeah.
Okay. Why am I here today?
Okay. Well, I'm glad you asked. We'll talk a little bit. Any point you got questions for us, you can feel free to stop us. This is more of a conversation than interrogation or anything else.
It's not a formal crucifixion or something?
Yeah, no, I don't think that is.
I like you guys, by the way.
Well,
I mean, you know, you've been courteous to me, and I want to thank you, and I appreciate that. And I'm going to continue to be courteous to you.
Okay.
This is a process, and I know we both have to go through it, and we're obviously on other sides of that. But
yeah, well, I agree. So you said last time that I was here that if there were some new things that popped up, that you'd be willing to talk to us about it.
Possibly.
Okay, all right. So there was some jewelry that matched some that was missing from Miss Suttles that was found in your house. Just tell me about it.
Not a big deal.
Okay.
She'd asked me to go ahead and sell some stuff for her. From what I gathered, she was very, very pressed for money.
She needs money, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you end up selling any of it for her?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
And I brought her back the money.
You brought her the money. How much money do you think you sold with the jewelry for her?
I think $1,173, or it was $1,073. Why? What's the deal on this?
Well, all right. I guess I made you a deal a while ago. I have to be straight with you, and I'm gonna keep that agreement. I'm gonna do it.
Okay.
But how about this? Just let me talk for a couple minutes. You think through as we're talking,
Okay.
and then whatever decision you think is the best way to make, we'll go with that. So there were other things found at your house, and so just hear me out.
You see his head going forward because he wants to try to figure out how to spin this. And I want him to finish listening to everything I had to say before he feels the need to speak. That gives them a little bit of a mental break where they don't feel like they have to come up with a lie or an untruth to me.
There were some other things found at your house. There was several other things of Enda's belongings that were found at your house. There was quite a lot of stuff found in your B house. It's on the back part of your property.
Okay.
And so there could be a million explanations for some of that stuff, and I don't want to jump to conclusions. And if there's something that happened that you didn't intend to happen, let's talk about it. And so if you'll just be honest with me.
You asked me, I'm trying to remember your wording here, if I would like the Bureau to tell my story,
right,
to let you know.
Yeah.
There are things that have to happen, and there are things that are going to happen. And I'm a realist, and I have acceptance with this. I would like a little bit of control in how they happen. And I believe I have a shot, ever so slight. If you tell them to turn that off, I will talk to you a little more freely.
Agent Newsom knew that if he didn't turn that camera off, that was probably going to be the end of the conversation. Daniel Prince was ready. He was vulnerable. We needed to capitalize on it.
The condition that the video recording was turned off. So I talked with Greg and he made that.
Now, before we go any further, this might sound really strange to you. Can we pray?
Sure.
Heavenly Father, in the name of you know I have sinned mightily, like King David sinned mightily. Lord, I want to purge myself of all my sins. I wish to use these men as the conduit to do that.
And out of respect for that, I'm not going to lie to them. And I'm not going to lie before you. And I praise you and I thank you for your Hillary and your help in this, Lord. In the name of Amen.
Amen. It's an appropriate, powerful prayer.
We're brothers in the Lord. I'm just asking you to help me fix the crap I got myself into.
Yeah, that's my goal. I was praying that God would prepare your heart for this.
If they kill me, I want you there when they do it to pray for me. You two are the only detectives I want to do. So this is your baby. And this is what I want our goal to be, guys. Okay, I mean, I'm not trying to make demands on you. You are the authority here. This is my goal. Dan gets life in a federal prison. I don't even care about numbers. L-I-F-E, federal prison. And that needs to be in writing. Will you gentlemen work with me to obtain those goals?
Okay. You've kind of said your part. I'll say mine. I could set these things in motion. I cannot speak for the state, but in order for me to have the most power, I need an inkling of what I need.
Hypothetically. Fair enough.
He was leaning forward, very close to me, looking at me almost with a more pleading look. So I was completely comfortable with him talking, in quote unquote hypotheticals, because how that would sound to a jury would still be very damning.
Okay. Let's put it this way. A person I was very good friends with wanted to do something to put someone basically out of their misery that was very closely related to them. That's one body. That person started having an extreme amount of guilt over this and decided they were going to go tell what had happened. That's the second body.
He's clicking off in his hands about different bodies. The second body that he's talking about is Miss Nancy Arrigo. We believe the first person he's talking about there is Miss Dolores Sellers, Nancy Arrigo's mother.
There's a third body that I did not kill. That a person I was trying to help out. And I knew that they'd be getting Social Security disability for the rest of their life. So I got rid of said bodies, for example, so that I could continue to use the card.
That individual there he's describing is Miss Goodman. We were able to confirm he was collecting her Social Security payments. Now, we wanted to get a statement from him about Miss Suttles.
By any chance, while he's getting all this squared away, can you just help me get that closure for Ed and his family?
Not until I have this. I clam up like a clam if this doesn't go federal for everything.
Well, do you at least know a good location?
I could give you within 3 feet.
I knew he felt like things were kind of moving fast, and he needed some control of how that happened. He wanted life in a federal prison, and then once I agree to that and I fulfill my end, he'll then help us with the investigation and take us to the body of Miss Suttles. He kind of dangles that over our heads, took it as kind of reasserting some dominance, hopefully reasserting control, which is what he wanted throughout this case.
All right, well, I've got my work cut up. I'm going to get started.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It'd be lovely if friendships formed out of this.
Stranger things have happened.
Yes, it has.
I went and checked him out of jail, drove him in my car, took him in the woods. He walked me to a spot and pointed to it and said, "She's right there."
It really wasn't too far from his house, and she was buried couple of feet down.
The body of Miss Rigo and Miss Goodman were not able to be recovered. An autopsy was conducted. We do believe strongly that Mr. Prince used the cocktail of medications to incapacitate Miss Suttles.
Absolutely incredible that we were able to bring her home. And the monster who did this to not just Edna, but the other women and their families, he was going to face the justice that he deserves.
There is something to be said about the closure, but at the same time, it takes away any hope you may have. You know your mother's never coming back. I can't even put it into words the way it makes you feel.
Daniel Prince of Bostic pleaded guilty in federal court in Spartanburg in the kidnapping and death of Edna Suttles.
Authorities called Daniel Prince a monster and serial killer. They say he's also responsible for the disappearance or death of at least 3 other women.
In exchange for a life sentence, he took the responsibility for the deaths of Edna Suttles, Nancy Rigo, Dolores Sellers, and Leah Goodman. The guy is a monster and a master manipulator.
He's a very controlling person. He always felt the need to kind of keep me in my place, but you just have to check your ego because it was important for the victims. It was important for the case. I feel like I did everything I could for those families. I don't know that anything will make them feel better.
Nancy Ann. Say hey, baby.
Aunt Dolores was our matriarch. We all looked to Aunt Dolores. Nancy Ann loved life. She was so effervescent. And Aunt Dolores the same way. So I hope with all that I am that we can carry on their legacy.
My life has a big hole in it now. I can see Edna in everything I do. And she's missed every day. I know my life is not as blessed as it was, but I am blessed to have known her.
On the evening of October 23rd, 2019, Rome appeared exactly as it had on countless autumn nights before. The streets of the Appio Latino district were still alive with conversations drifting out of neighborhood bars. Glasses clinked inside crowded pubs. Friends lingered on sidewalks before saying their goodbyes. Nothing about that Thursday night suggested that it would soon become one of the most talked about criminal investigations in modern Italian history. At approximately 11:43 p.m., outside the John Cabot pub on Via Teodoro Mommsen, violence erupted with astonishing speed. A young woman was struck in the head with a metal club as someone attempted to seize the backpack she was carrying. Her boyfriend immediately turned to protect her. Seconds later, a single gunshot shattered the routine sounds of the neighborhood. 24-year-old Luca Sacchai collapsed onto the pavement with a catastrophic wound to the head and neck. The attackers fled almost immediately, disappearing into the night before many witnesses could fully understand what had happened. The entire attack lasted roughly 30 seconds. By the following morning, Luca Sacchai was dead. In the first hours after the shooting, the story appeared painfully simple. Italian newspapers described a courageous young man who had sacrificed his own life while trying to defend the woman he loved from armed robbers. It was the kind of tragedy that resonated immediately with the public. A young fitness trainer, an ordinary evening out, a senseless act of street violence. People mourned Luca as a hero, someone who instinctively stepped between danger and another person without hesitation. The narrative spread quickly because it seemed to answer every obvious question. Two criminals wanted a backpack. Luca resisted. One of them fired a gun. End of story. But criminal investigations rarely end with the first story people choose to believe. Detectives assigned to the case were trained to examine details rather than emotions. They collected surveillance footage. They recovered physical evidence. They analyzed mobile phone records. One inconsistency led to another. Each discovery chipped away at the original explanation until investigators were forced to ask a far more uncomfortable question. What if this had never been a random robbery at all? What if the backpack had been targeted for a reason? What if the attackers already knew exactly who they were waiting for? Over the following months, and then years, the investigation would transform public understanding of Luca Sacciai's death. What initially appeared to be a straightforward case of street violence evolved into a far more complicated story involving alleged drug trafficking, hidden communications, conflicting statements, and an operation that prosecutors argued had gone disastrously wrong. Yet amid all the legal arguments and sensational headlines, one fact never changed. A 24-year-old man had lost his life in less than half a minute. Whatever had unfolded before that night, whatever conversations had taken place, whatever plans had been made by others, Luca Sacciai's family would never again see their son return home. This is the story of how one of Italy's most shocking murder investigations unfolded, not through rumors or speculation, but through the evidence investigators painstakingly assembled piece by piece until a very different picture emerged from the one the public first believed. Before his name became associated with one of Italy's most controversial murder cases, Luca Sacciai was known for something entirely different. Friends and acquaintances recognized him as a personal trainer living in Rome, someone who had built his daily life around physical fitness and discipline. At only 24 years old, he had established a reputation within the local fitness community, where his work brought him into regular contact with clients seeking healthier lifestyles. His profession required consistency, patience, and long hours, qualities that often define personal trainers whose success depends largely on trust and personal relationships. Although media coverage would later focus almost exclusively on the circumstances of his death, those who knew him remembered a young man whose identity extended far beyond the headlines that would eventually surround his name. He was living in Rome, one of Europe's busiest capitals, where ancient history exists alongside the routines of modern urban life. The city's neighborhoods each possess their own rhythm, and the Appio Latino district, where the events of October 23rd unfolded, is no exception. Residential streets, local businesses, neighborhood bars, and familiar gathering places create an environment where evenings are often spent with friends rather than tourists. John Cabot Pub was one such location, a place where people met after work, watched football matches, shared conversations, and ended ordinary days in ordinary ways. On that Thursday evening, Luca arrived there with his girlfriend, Anastasia Kylemik, a Ukrainian woman living in Italy. Their relationship had become part of Luca's everyday life, and there was nothing outwardly remarkable about their decision to spend the evening together at the pub. Surveillance cameras would later establish an important detail for investigators. The couple remained inside the establishment for more than an hour. During that time, they met acquaintances, talked with people they knew, and, by every available account, behaved like any other patrons enjoying a night out. Nothing recorded during those hours suggested that violence was imminent. Nothing indicated that, outside the walls of the pub, events were already moving toward a fatal conclusion. At that same time, investigators would later determine, two men were repeatedly moving around the surrounding area, according to the evidence eventually presented during the investigation. Valerio Del Grosso and Paolo Perino did not happen upon Luca and Anastasia by chance. Surveillance footage later indicated that they had been driving around the neighborhood and communicating before the attack. That conclusion would become critically important, but on the evening itself, nobody inside the pub had reason to suspect that anyone outside was waiting. Luca himself certainly showed no indication that he believed he was in danger. The significance of that ordinary evening cannot be overstated because it explains why the initial public reaction was so powerful. People identified with the routine. Countless couples leave restaurants, cafes, and pubs every night believing they're simply heading home. The distance between an uneventful evening and unimaginable tragedy can sometimes be measured not in hours, but in seconds. For Luca and Anastasia, that distance was the short walk from the entrance of the John Cabot pub to the sidewalk outside. As the evening drew to a close, they prepared to leave, just as dozens of other customers had done before them. Surveillance footage later confirmed that they exited the pub at approximately 11:43 p.m. The street outside looked ordinary. There were no obvious warning signs, no visible indication that two men had allegedly been waiting for precisely this moment. The transition from normality to violence happened so quickly that witnesses would later describe confusion almost as much as fear. One instant, people were saying goodbye after an evening with friends. The next, a young woman had been struck with a metal object. A young man had been shot at close range. And the assumptions everyone made about what they had just witnessed would soon begin to unravel. The events that followed would not only change the lives of everyone directly involved, but would also challenge one of the oldest instincts in criminal investigations: the tendency to accept the first explanation that appears to make sense. For investigators, the real story had only just begun. By the time Luca Sachai and Anastasia Kylemnik prepared to leave John Cabot Pub on the night of October 23, 2019, the chain of events that would ultimately claim Luca's life was already in motion. From the perspective of everyone inside the pub, it had been an ordinary evening. The couple had spent more than an hour there, meeting acquaintances and enjoying a typical night out in Rome's Appiano Latino district. Yet outside, according to evidence later uncovered by investigators, two men had already positioned themselves nearby, waiting. Surveillance footage would eventually become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in reconstructing what happened that night. Investigators concluded that Valerio Del Grosso and Paolo Perino had not arrived by coincidence. Their movements suggested preparation rather than spontaneity. Cameras showed their vehicle appearing near the area multiple times before the attack. Phone records later demonstrated repeated communication between the suspects throughout the evening, reinforcing investigators' belief that their actions were coordinated. At the time, however, none of this was visible to Luca, Anastasia, or anyone leaving the pub. They could not have known that every minute which passed inside the building brought them closer to an encounter that investigators would later argue had been carefully anticipated. Shortly before midnight, the couple stepped outside and began walking away from the entrance. It was approximately 11:43 p.m. The street itself appeared calm. The transition from an ordinary evening to extraordinary violence happened almost instantaneously. According to the reconstruction presented through surveillance footage and witness testimony, Paolo Perino moved first. Carrying a metal club, he approached Anastasia from behind and struck her forcefully in the head. The attack was directed toward the backpack she was carrying. The blow caused her to fall onto the pavement before she had any realistic opportunity to react or protect herself. The violence of the strike immediately transformed what had moments earlier been an ordinary departure from a neighborhood pub into a desperate struggle for survival. Luca's response was immediate. Seeing his girlfriend collapse after being attacked, he instinctively turned back toward her. Rather than fleeing or freezing in confusion, he moved toward the attackers. According to the reconstruction accepted during the investigation, Luca advanced toward Valerio Del Grosso as the situation unfolded. the distance separating them rapidly closed to only a few meters. It was at this moment that the attack escalated from robbery to homicide. Del Grosso drew a handgun. There was no warning shot, no prolonged confrontation, no indication that he attempted to frighten Luca into retreating before using the weapon. Instead, investigators concluded that he raised the firearm and fired almost immediately. The bullet struck Luca in the head and neck area from close range. Years later, Italy's Court of Cassation would describe the shot as one aimed at a vital part of the body, a conclusion that became significant in evaluating intent during the judicial proceedings. For Luca, however, legal interpretations would come far too late. The effect of the shot was immediate and devastating. He collapsed onto the pavement only moments after attempting to intervene. Witnesses later described scenes of confusion as people struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The entire confrontation, from the first strike against Anastasia to the fatal gunshot and the attacker's escape, lasted roughly 30 seconds. 30 seconds, less time than it takes to cross a street or answer a telephone call. Within that brief span, an evening that had begun like countless others ended with irreversible consequences. After the shot was fired, Del Grosso and Perino fled the scene. Their departure was as rapid as the attack itself. Witnesses reported panic erupting almost immediately. Some shouted for help, while others attempted to distance themselves from the danger, uncertain whether additional shots might follow. The attackers disappeared before anyone could stop them. The speed of both the assault and the escape would later complicate the earliest stages of the investigation because there had been little opportunity for witnesses to clearly observe every detail. In the immediate aftermath, attention shifted entirely toward the victims left behind on the street. Anastasia, injured after the blow to her head, remained beside Luca. Witnesses described her embracing him and crying as blood spread across the pavement. The scene reflected the brutal reality that violent crimes often leave behind, not only physical evidence for investigators, but overwhelming trauma for everyone who experiences them firsthand. Emergency services responded quickly after receiving reports of the shooting. Medical personnel arrived and transported Luca to San Giovanni Hospital, where doctors immediately began emergency treatment. The seriousness of his injuries left little room for optimism. Medical teams performed emergency surgery in an effort to save his life, working through the night as family members and investigators waited for updates. Despite those efforts, the injuries proved unsurvivable. On the morning of October 24th, 2019, Luca Sacchai was pronounced dead. He was only 24 years old. In the midst of unimaginable grief, Luca's family made a decision that would become one of the few moments of hope associated with the tragedy. They chose to donate his organs, allowing others to benefit from a life that had ended far too soon. While criminal investigators focused on identifying the attackers, Luca's relatives faced a different reality altogether: the sudden loss of a son whose future had disappeared in less than half a minute. News of the shooting spread rapidly throughout Rome and then across Italy. Initial reports portrayed the incident as an armed robbery gone terribly wrong. According to the earliest accounts, two criminals had attempted to steal Anastasia's backpack. Luca had bravely stepped forward to defend her and paid with his life. It was a narrative that appeared tragically straightforward and one that immediately resonated with the public. Newspapers emphasized his courage, describing him as a young man who instinctively tried to protect the woman he loved. The story inspired sympathy precisely because it reflected values people instinctively admired: loyalty, bravery, and self-sacrifice in the face of sudden violence. Few questioned that explanation during the first days after the murder because it seemed entirely consistent with the physical evidence visible at the scene. A backpack had been targeted. A young woman had been assaulted. A young man had intervened. A gun had been fired. To observers, the sequence appeared complete. Yet experienced homicide investigators understand that the apparent simplicity of a crime scene can sometimes conceal a far more complicated reality. Every violent death leaves behind not only visible evidence, but also unanswered questions. Detectives assigned to Luca Sachai's case began collecting surveillance recordings from nearby cameras, interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence recovered from the scene, and tracing the movements of everyone known to have been involved. At first, their work simply sought to identify the two fleeing attackers. However, as additional evidence accumulated, investigators encountered details that no longer fit comfortably within the theory of a random street robbery. Certain discoveries seemed inconsistent with the behavior expected from ordinary thieves. Surveillance footage suggested planning rather than coincidence. Physical evidence raised new uncertainties. Phone records revealed patterns of communication extending beyond what investigators initially anticipated. Individually, each inconsistency might have appeared insignificant. Together, they began to challenge the very foundation of the story the public had already accepted. The 30 seconds that ended Luca Sachai's life would eventually be reconstructed with remarkable precision through cameras, forensic evidence, and telecommunications data. Ironically, however, understanding those 30 seconds proved to be only the beginning. The real mystery was no longer simply how Luca had been killed. It was why those 30 seconds had happened at all. As investigators continued assembling the evidence, the image of a random robbery slowly began to fracture, revealing a far more complex and deeply controversial narrative beneath the surface. The case that Italy believed it understood after one tragic night was about to become something entirely different. When homicide investigators first arrived at the scene outside John Cabot Pub, the evidence appeared to support the explanation already circulating among witnesses. A young woman had been assaulted. A backpack had apparently been the target. Her boyfriend had intervened. One of the attackers had fired a single shot before fleeing. It was a tragic sequence that fit the profile of a robbery escalating into murder. Cases like this, while deeply disturbing, were not unheard of. At first glance, there seemed to be little reason to suspect that the events of October 23, 2019, involved anything more complicated. Yet experienced investigators are trained to approach every crime scene with caution, resisting the temptation to accept the most obvious explanation before every piece of evidence has been examined. Rather than building a case around assumptions, detectives began collecting every available fact. Witnesses were interviewed separately. Security cameras from surrounding streets were secured before recordings could be overwritten. Physical evidence was documented in detail. Investigators also began tracing the movements and communications of those connected to the victims. During the earliest hours of the investigation, these procedures were simply part of standard homicide inquiry. Within days, however, they would reveal inconsistencies significant enough to reshape the entire direction of the case. The first account investigators received from Anastasia Kylemnik appeared straightforward. According to her initial statement, two men had suddenly approached as she and Luca left the pub. One of them struck her in the head while attempting to seize her backpack. Luca immediately stepped in to defend her. During that confrontation, one attacker drew a firearm and shot him before both suspects escaped. Her description aligned closely with what witnesses had observed in those frantic 30 seconds. Nothing in her initial version immediately contradicted the visible facts at the scene. As a result, both investigators and the public initially viewed Luca as the victim of a random act of violent street crime. Newspapers quickly embraced that narrative. Headlines described a young personal trainer who had sacrificed his life protecting his girlfriend from robbers. Public sympathy was overwhelming. Friends mourned him. Members of the fitness community expressed disbelief. The image of a young man dying while defending someone he loved resonated deeply across Italy. But while public opinion settled rapidly around that explanation, investigators continued asking questions that the headlines could not answer. One of those questions centered on the backpack itself. According to the original account, stealing the backpack had been the attacker's primary objective. If that were true, detectives expected its contents to reflect the motives of ordinary thieves. After the suspects were later identified, investigators eventually recovered the missing backpack. What they found immediately raised doubts about the robbery theory. Inside remained personal identification documents. More surprisingly, over 2,000 euros in cash had also been left behind. This discovery created an obvious contradiction. Criminals willing to assault one victim and shoot another at close range would ordinarily be expected to take any readily available money. Leaving behind such a substantial amount of cash appeared inconsistent with a straightforward robbery motivated by financial gain. Detectives therefore confronted an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the backpack itself had been important for reasons other than the money that remained inside. If the attackers were specifically interested in the bag rather than its visible contents, then investigators needed to understand what they believed the backpack contained before the attack began. That single inconsistency transformed the backpack from ordinary stolen property into one of the investigation's central pieces of evidence. At roughly the same time, another source of evidence began reshaping detectives' understanding of the crime. Security cameras positioned around the neighborhood provided investigators with an opportunity to reconstruct movements before the shooting occurred. Modern criminal investigations increasingly depend upon surveillance technology because cameras capture events without the limitations of human memory or perception. Unlike eyewitnesses, recordings are unaffected by fear, confusion, or the passage of time. As investigators reviewed footage collected from the area surrounding John Cabot Pub, they noticed something unexpected. The two eventual suspects did not simply appear moments before the attack. Instead, surveillance indicated that Valerio Del Grosso and Paolo Perino had been present in the neighborhood earlier, moving around the area before Luca and Anastasia left the pub. Their vehicle appeared multiple times near the location. Rather than suggesting an accidental encounter, the recordings indicated waiting and repeated movement around the vicinity. This observation significantly altered investigators' interpretation of the attack. Random robbers generally search for opportunities as they arise. The surveillance footage instead suggested preparation. Detectives began considering whether the victims had been selected in advance rather than encountered by chance. If the suspects already knew who they intended to confront, then the motive behind the attack could be very different from ordinary street robbery. The footage did not answer every question, but it established an important foundation. The attack appeared coordinated rather than spontaneous. That realization prompted investigators to broaden their inquiry beyond the physical crime scene. Attention shifted toward digital evidence, particularly mobile telephone records. In modern homicide investigations, communication data often reveals relationships invisible at the crime scene itself. Investigators therefore seized and examined the mobile phones of several individuals connected to the case, including Anastasia Kylemnik, Giovanni Princi, Valerio Del Grosso, and Paolo Perino. What emerged from that analysis represented perhaps the most significant turning point in the investigation. Detectives discovered extensive communication occurring before and after the shooting. Numerous calls and messages linked individuals whose relationships extended beyond the simple narrative of strangers meeting during a robbery. Particularly notable was the volume of activity associated with Del Grosso's phone. Investigators documented hundreds of calls and messages on the day of the homicide. suggesting continuous coordination rather than impulsive criminal behavior. The communications themselves became increasingly important because they coincided with surveillance. Footage showing repeated movements around the area. Together, the physical and digital evidence painted a picture of planning. Detectives no longer viewed the shooting as an isolated event beginning the moment Luca and Anastasia exited the pub. Instead, the attack appeared connected to communications and movements that had started hours earlier. Another significant connection also emerged from the phone analysis. Investigators identified repeated contacts involving Giovanni Princi, described as a friend of Luca Sacchai. His communications, together with those involving Anastasia and the eventual suspects, became central to reconstructing events leading up to the shooting. Detectives were no longer examining only what had happened on Via Teodoro Momsen during 30 violent seconds. They were attempting to determine what had been planned before anyone reached the street outside the pub. Each new piece of evidence weakened confidence in the original robbery narrative. The recovered backpack contradicted expectations. Surveillance footage suggested deliberate waiting. Mobile phone records demonstrated extensive coordination. None of these discoveries alone established the complete motive behind the homicide, but collectively they pointed investigators toward a conclusion that had scarcely been considered during the first days after Luca's death. The possibility emerged that the robbery itself might not have been the primary crime at all. Instead, it could have been the visible ending of a sequence of events already unfolding long before the fatal confrontation. Prosecutors gradually began assembling a different theory, one that centered not on random violence, but on an alleged drug transaction involving a far larger sum of money than the cash ultimately recovered inside the backpack. According to that developing theory, the backpack had indeed been the target, but not because of the 2,000 euros investigators eventually found inside it. Detectives instead began asking whether the attackers believed the bag contained approximately 70,000 euros intended for a planned purchase of 15 kilograms of marijuana. If that theory proved correct, then the attack outside John Cabot Pub had never been an ordinary robbery. It had been the violent collapse of an operation already in motion before Luca and Anastasia ever stepped outside. Yet even as investigators pursued this new direction, one important legal distinction remained. The evidence did not establish that Luca himself had organized or negotiated any alleged drug transaction. That question would become one of the most carefully examined issues during the years of judicial proceedings that followed. For the investigators, however, the immediate priority remained unchanged. They needed to identify everyone involved, determine each person's role, and reconstruct precisely how an apparent robbery had evolved into one of Italy's most controversial homicide cases. The answers, they believed, were hidden not in speculation, but within the growing body of evidence that continued to accumulate piece by piece. As investigators continued comparing surveillance footage, physical evidence, witness statements, and mobile phone records, the original theory of a random street robbery became increasingly difficult to defend. Every new discovery appeared to point in the same direction. The attack had not been spontaneous. It had been prepared in advance. What remained unclear was the purpose behind that preparation. If the objective had not simply been to steal an ordinary backpack, then what had made Luca Sacchai and Anastasia Kylemnik the focus of such a carefully coordinated attack? Prosecutors gradually developed an answer that would transform public understanding of the case. According to the theory presented during the investigation and later before the courts, the events outside John Cabot Pub were not isolated acts of street violence. Instead, they represented the violent collapse of an alleged drug transaction involving a quantity of marijuana and a sum of money far larger than anyone had initially imagined. The prosecution alleged that the individuals involved had been preparing for the purchase of approximately 15 kilograms of marijuana, valued at around 70,000 euros. According to this reconstruction, the meeting scheduled that evening was intended to bring together two groups. One side would allegedly arrive with the money. The other would arrive with the drugs. Investigators believed that this planned exchange explained why the suspects had appeared to know exactly where and when to wait, rather than searching for an opportunity to rob random pedestrians. Prosecutors argued that they had been anticipating a specific meeting connected to a prearranged transaction. This interpretation also offered a possible explanation for the mystery surrounding the backpack. Detectives had never been satisfied with the idea that experienced criminals would leave more than 2,000 euros behind if ordinary theft had been their only objective. Under the prosecution's theory, however, the attackers believed the backpack was associated with a much larger amount of money, approximately 70,000 euros allegedly intended for the purchase. If that assumption guided their actions, then the bag itself became far more significant than the cash ultimately recovered inside it. According to prosecutors, the planned transaction never reached the point where drugs were exchanged. Instead, they alleged that members of the selling side decided to seize the money without delivering the promised marijuana. In other words, rather than completing the transaction, they allegedly chose to rob the buyers. This interpretation fundamentally changed the meaning of the attack. What had initially appeared to be a random robbery became, according to investigators, an attempted theft targeting money connected to an illegal transaction. The violence outside the pub, therefore, represented not the beginning of the crime, but its final and most visible stage. As investigators continued reconstructing the alleged plan, they focused on the specific roles played by each individual connected to the case. One of the most significant names was Giovanni Princi, described as a friend of Luca Sacchai. According to prosecutors, Princi acted as the intermediary responsible for arranging communication between the parties involved in the planned marijuana purchase. His alleged role was not that of a direct participant in the violence itself, but of someone who helped organize the meeting that eventually led to the fatal confrontation. The investigation into his communications became particularly important because phone records demonstrated repeated contacts among several individuals before the shooting. Those communications helped prosecutors argue that the meeting outside the pub had not been accidental, but had instead resulted from prior coordination. Anastasia Kylemnik also became a central figure in the prosecution's reconstruction of events. During the earliest stage of the investigation, she had described herself solely as the victim of a robbery. She stated that she knew nothing about any drug transaction and maintained that the attack had been an unexpected act of violence targeting her backpack. As investigators examined phone records, conversations, and witness testimony, however, prosecutors reached a different conclusion. They argued that Anastasia had been involved in preparing for the alleged purchase and that the backpack she carried played a role in that arrangement. According to the prosecution's theory, she was allegedly carrying the money intended for the transaction. This conclusion became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case because it directly contradicted the narrative presented during the investigation's earliest days. Anastasia consistently denied broader allegations regarding the events leading to the shooting. Nevertheless, prosecutors argued that the evidence collected from communications and witness testimony supported their interpretation. Her legal responsibility would ultimately become a separate issue from the homicide itself. But throughout the investigation, her role remained one of the most closely scrutinized subjects. On the opposite side of the alleged transaction stood Valerio Del Grosso and Paolo Perino. By this stage of the investigation, authorities had already concluded that Del Grosso was the individual who fired the fatal shot, while Perino assaulted Anastasia with the metal club. prosecutors alleged that both men participated in the planned robbery connected to the failed drug deal. According to their reconstruction, Perino's task was to attack Anastasia and seize the backpack while Del Grosso provided armed protection for the operation. When Luca intervened, prosecutors argued. Del Grosso responded by drawing his handgun and firing a single shot at close range. The prosecution maintained that the shooting was not an accidental discharge, nor a warning intended, merely to frighten Luca away. Instead, the evidence indicated that the firearm had been deliberately aimed at a vital part of his body. This interpretation would later become an important factor during the judicial proceedings, particularly when courts considered the degree of criminal responsibility associated with the homicide. Another individual eventually drawn into the investigation was Marcello DePropris. Prosecutors alleged that he had supplied the handgun used during the attack and had participated in preparations for the robbery. Although he was not accused of being physically present when Luca was shot, investigators argued that his alleged contribution remained significant because it involved providing the weapon ultimately used in the homicide. His inclusion illustrated the prosecution's broader effort to identify everyone whose actions allegedly contributed to the events of October 23rd, rather than limiting responsibility solely to the individuals present on the street. Amid these allegations, investigators and prosecutors continued making one important distinction concerning Luca Sacchai himself. Despite the prosecution's reconstruction of an alleged drug transaction, the courts ultimately concluded that there was no evidence proving Luca had directly negotiated or organized the purchase of marijuana. This distinction became crucial because public discussion often blurred the difference between association and participation. According to the judicial findings, while evidence supported the existence of communications and preparations involving other individuals, investigators did not establish that Luca himself had taken part in arranging the alleged deal. Instead, the courts concluded that he became the victim of lethal violence after intervening when Anastasia was assaulted. That legal conclusion preserved a critical separation between the alleged criminal activities examined during the investigation and Luca's own role during the fatal confrontation. Regardless of what others may have planned, the evidence accepted by the court showed that the immediate reason for his death was his attempt to react when the attack began. The prosecution's reconstruction also helped explain why surveillance footage showed Del Grosso and Perino waiting near the pub before Luca and Anastasia emerged. Under the robbery theory alone, their repeated movements around the neighborhood appeared unusual. Within the framework of the alleged drug transaction, however, those movements reflected preparation for a scheduled meeting rather than random criminal opportunity. Similarly, the extensive phone communications documented by investigators became easier to interpret as part of ongoing coordination leading up to the encounter. Although the prosecution's theory dramatically altered public perception of the case, it also generated widespread debate throughout Italy. The contrast between the original narrative of a heroic victim of random violence and the later allegations involving a failed drug transaction created intense media attention. Newspapers that had initially focused almost exclusively on Luca's bravery now devoted extensive coverage to the investigation itself, examining phone records, surveillance footage, and the evolving legal arguments presented by prosecutors and defense attorneys. Public discussion increasingly centered on the complexity of the evidence rather than the simplicity of the original robbery story. Yet despite those debates, one fundamental reality remained unchanged. Whether viewed through the lens of a robbery or an alleged drug transaction, the fatal sequence outside John Cabot Pub still unfolded in approximately 30 seconds. The planning may have extended across hours or even longer. Communications may have connected multiple individuals before that night. prosecutors may have reconstructed a larger criminal operation surrounding the meeting. But when violence finally erupted, everything happened with extraordinary speed. A blow from a metal club, an instinctive attempt to protect another person, a handgun drawn without warning, one shot fired at close range. Then silence broken only by panic and the arrival of emergency responders. The complexity uncovered by investigators explained why the attack occurred, at least according to the prosecution's theory. But it could never diminish the simplicity of its human consequence. A young man who had entered a neighborhood pub, expecting an ordinary evening, never returned home. As prosecutors prepared to present their case before the courts, investigators believed they had assembled a coherent reconstruction supported by surveillance footage, communications data, recovered physical evidence, and witness testimony. The next challenge would be transforming that reconstruction into legally proven responsibility. The investigation was entering its final phase. What remained was the courtroom, where every allegation would be tested against the evidence and every defendant's role would be examined under judicial scrutiny before the Italian legal system reached its final conclusions. As the investigation progressed, detectives gradually transformed a collection of individual clues into a coherent timeline. Surveillance footage established movements before the attack. Witness statements reconstructed the 30 seconds of violence outside John Cabot Pub. The recovered backpack introduced questions that challenged the original robbery narrative, while the examination of mobile phone records suggested an organized sequence of events rather than a chance encounter. The remaining challenge for investigators was identifying everyone involved, determining each person's role, and gathering sufficient evidence to support criminal charges. That process moved quickly after one unexpected development. Only 2 days after the shooting, the investigation received a significant breakthrough. According to the evidence later presented during the proceedings, the mother of Valerio Del Grosso contacted the police because she suspected that her son might have been connected to the homicide. Although investigators had already been collecting surveillance recordings and analyzing communications, this information accelerated their efforts to identify and locate the individuals believed to be responsible. The importance of this moment cannot be overstated. Many major criminal investigations advance slowly, relying on months of forensic analysis before suspects can be identified with confidence. In Luca Sacciai's case, investigators were able to combine witness testimony, surveillance evidence, and a new lead concerning Del Grosso into a rapidly developing inquiry. Once authorities focused on Del Grosso, attention naturally expanded to Paolo Perino, whose actions during the assault had also been documented through the growing body of evidence. The investigation soon extended beyond simply locating the suspects. Detectives also sought physical evidence capable of corroborating the reconstruction they had already begun assembling. Following his arrest, Del Grosso provided investigators with information that allowed them to recover important evidence connected to the crime. Among the most significant discoveries was the location where the stolen backpack had been discarded. Investigators also recovered information concerning the disposal of the weapon and other items connected to the attack. These recoveries proved valuable because they reinforced conclusions already suggested by surveillance footage and witness testimony. In criminal investigations, physical evidence often serves as an independent confirmation of events described through other sources, rather than relying solely on recollections or digital records. Detectives were now able to demonstrate connections between suspects and objects directly associated with the homicide. As investigators continued examining seized mobile phones, communication records remained central to understanding how the events of October 23rd had unfolded. The large volume of calls and messages exchanged before and after the shooting supported the prosecution's argument that the attack had been coordinated rather than spontaneous. combined with the surveillance footage showing repeated movements around the area before Luca and Anastasia exited the pub. The communications data strengthened the theory that the confrontation outside John Cabot pub had been anticipated in advance. Investigators also continued interviewing witnesses whose observations, although limited by the speed of the attack, contributed additional details to the chronology of events. Every statement was compared against surveillance footage and digital evidence to identify consistencies and contradictions. This careful comparison reflected one of the fundamental principles of homicide investigations. No single source of evidence should stand alone when independent verification is possible. By the time prosecutors prepared formal charges, they believed the evidence collectively established a comprehensive reconstruction of both the planning and execution of crime. The case eventually entered the courtroom, where the evidence gathered during months of investigation would undergo detailed legal examination. Unlike the immediate public reaction following Luca's death, judicial proceedings required every allegation to be supported through admissible evidence rather than public opinion. Prosecutors presented their reconstruction of the events leading to the shooting, relying upon surveillance footage, communications data, recovered physical evidence, and witness testimony to explain how they believed the homicide had occurred. Central to the prosecution's case was the argument that the apparent robbery had in fact been connected to the alleged drug transaction involving approximately 15 kilograms of marijuana and around 70,000 euros. According to prosecutors, this broader context explained why the suspects appeared to know where and when to wait for Luca and Anastasia, and why the backpack had become the focus of the attack. The prosecution argued that Valerio Del Grosso had deliberately fired the fatal shot after Luca intervened while Paolo Perino assaulted Anastasia in an attempt to seize the backpack. They further alleged that Marcelo de Propris had supplied the firearm used during the crime and had participated in preparations for the robbery. Giovanni Princi was presented as the intermediary who had allegedly helped arrange the planned drug transaction through his communications with the other individuals involved. Anastasia Kylemnik's role remained one of the most contested aspects of the proceedings. Throughout the investigation, she had maintained that she had no knowledge of any drug transaction and had initially described herself solely as the victim of a robbery. Prosecutors, however, argued that evidence obtained from phone records, conversations, and witness testimony demonstrated her involvement in preparing for the alleged purchase. Although the homicide itself dominated public attention, the legal proceedings require the court to evaluate each defendant separately according to the available evidence and the specific charges brought against them. The distinction between direct participation in the shooting and involvement in the broader alleged criminal activity became an important aspect of the judicial process. Throughout the trial, one legal conclusion remained especially significant regarding Luca Sacchai himself. Despite the prosecution's reconstruction of the alleged drug transaction, the court concluded that there was no evidence demonstrating that Luca had directly negotiated or organized the purchase of marijuana. This finding established an important boundary within the case. While prosecutors argued that others had participated in planning the transaction, the evidence accepted by the court did not establish Luca as one of its organizers. Instead, the judicial findings recognized that he was killed after intervening during the assault on Anastasia. This distinction became essential because public discussion surrounding the case frequently blurred the differences between the various individuals involved. The court's responsibility, however, was to determine legal responsibility based on evidence rather than assumptions arising from association alone. After examining the evidence presented throughout the proceedings, the courts issued their judgments. Valerio Del Grosso, identified as the man who fired the fatal shot, was sentenced to 27 years in prison. The court concluded that he bore direct responsibility for the killing of Luca Sacchai. Paolo Pirino, who participated in the assault on Anastasia and the attempted seizure of the backpack, received a final sentence of 24 years and 1 month in prison for his role in the crimes. Marcello de Propris, whom prosecutors established had supplied the handgun used during the attack and participated in preparations for the robbery, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Anastasia Kylemek was convicted not of homicide, but of violating Italy's drug laws. The court sentenced her to 3 years imprisonment for that offense, while not finding her guilty of murder. These decisions reflected the court's effort to distinguish between different levels of criminal responsibility based upon each individual's proven actions rather than treating every defendant identically. The judicial process did not end with the initial verdicts. As is common in major criminal cases, the defendants pursued appeals through the Italian legal system. Appellate courts reviewed the evidence, the legal reasoning applied during earlier proceedings, and the conclusions reached by the lower courts. Over time, the case continued attracting significant public attention because it had evolved far beyond the simple robbery narrative first presented in the days immediately following Luca's death. Journalists closely followed each stage of the appeals process, while public debate continued regarding the evidence and the prosecution's reconstruction of events. Eventually, the case reached Italy's Court of Cassation, the country's highest court for criminal matters. In 2025, the Court of Cassation upheld the convictions, confirming the sentences imposed during the earlier proceedings. With that decision, the legal process reached its conclusion. Years after the fatal shooting outside John Cabot Pub, the judicial system had delivered its final judgment regarding the responsibilities of those involved. For investigators, prosecutors, and judges, the case demonstrated how careful examination of evidence can fundamentally alter the understanding of a violent crime. What first appeared to be a straightforward robbery had, through surveillance recordings, physical evidence, communication records, and witness testimony, become a far more complex criminal investigation involving multiple participants in an alleged failed drug transaction. Yet, while the courts resolved questions of legal responsibility, their judgments could not erase the human consequences that had first drawn national attention to the case. A 24-year-old personal trainer had left a neighborhood pub expecting to return home after an ordinary evening. Instead, his life ended during approximately 30 seconds of violence on a Roman street. The legal proceedings explained how the crime occurred and assigned responsibility under the law, but they could never restore the future that disappeared with a single gunshot on the night of October 23, 2019. When the Court of Cassation upheld the convictions in 2025, the legal chapter of the Luca Sacchai case finally came to an end. Nearly 6 years had passed since the gunshot outside John Cabot Pub echoed through the Appio Latino district of Rome. During those years, investigators reconstructed a complex sequence of events. Prosecutors presented their case through multiple levels of judicial review. Defense attorneys challenged the evidence, and the courts ultimately reached conclusions regarding the responsibility of each defendant. From a legal perspective, the case had reached its final destination. The sentences imposed on Valerio Del Grosso, Paolo Pirino, Marcello de Propris, and Anastasia Kylemek remained in place. The Italian justice system had spoken with finality. Yet for Luca Sacchai's family, no court ruling could truly mark the end of the story. Criminal verdicts can establish legal accountability, but they cannot restore a life that has been lost. They cannot return an empty chair at family gatherings, erase years of grief, or answer every emotional question left behind after an act of violence. For those who knew Luca personally, October 23, 2019, remained the dividing line between life before the tragedy and life after it. The legal process explained many of the events that led to his death. But explanation is not the same as healing. Throughout the investigation, one decision made by Luca's family stood apart from the legal arguments and media attention surrounding the case. After doctors confirmed that Luca could not be saved despite emergency surgery at San Giovanni Hospital, his family agreed to donate his organs. In the midst of overwhelming personal loss, they chose to allow others the opportunity to live. It was a decision made quietly, away from the debates about drug transactions, surveillance footage, and criminal responsibility that would later dominate public discussion. While newspapers focused on court proceedings and investigators analyzed communications between suspects, Luca's family was confronting a far more personal reality. Their son was gone. Their grief existed independently of every legal argument presented in court. The organ donation became one of the few aspects of the story capable of offering hope within an otherwise devastating tragedy. It served as a reminder that even amid extraordinary violence, acts of humanity can still emerge. Another lasting consequence of the case was the profound shift in public perception that occurred as the investigation unfolded. During the first days after the shooting, much of Italy believed it understood exactly what had happened. The explanation seemed simple and emotionally compelling. A young man had died protecting his girlfriend during a random robbery. It was a story that fit comfortably within familiar narratives of courage and senseless violence. As investigators uncovered additional evidence, however, that certainty gradually disappeared. Surveillance footage recovered physical evidence, and mobile phone records forced both investigators and the public to reconsider their assumptions. The evolution of the case demonstrated how initial impressions, even when sincerely held, can prove incomplete. Public opinion often forms rapidly after highly publicized crimes because people naturally seek clear explanations for shocking events. Yet criminal investigations operate according to a different standard. Detectives cannot rely upon assumptions, no matter how persuasive those assumptions may initially appear. Instead, every conclusion must be supported by evidence capable of withstanding legal scrutiny. The Luca Sacchai investigation illustrated this principle with unusual clarity. Had investigators accepted the robbery theory without further examination, many of the facts ultimately presented before the courts might never have come to light. The recovered backpack would have remained an unexplained anomaly. Surveillance footage suggesting prior preparation might have received less attention. The extensive communications revealed through mobile phone analysis could have gone undiscovered or unexamined. Instead, investigators continued asking questions long after the public believed the answers were already known. That persistence fundamentally altered the understanding of the case. It also highlighted the increasingly important role that technology plays in modern criminal investigations. Surveillance cameras proved essential in reconstructing the suspect's movements before the attack, rather than relying exclusively on eyewitness memory. Investigators could compare witness statements against objective recordings documenting the suspect's presence in the area. The footage established that Del Grosso and Perino had not simply appeared moments before the shooting, but had moved around the neighborhood while apparently waiting for Luca and Anastasia to emerge from the pub. This evidence significantly influenced investigators' conclusion that the attack had been prepared, rather than spontaneous. Equally significant were the mobile phone records examined during the investigation. Communications between various individuals provided investigators with an opportunity to reconstruct relationships and coordination extending beyond the brief confrontation captured by witnesses. Hundreds of calls and messages documented patterns that would have remained invisible without digital forensic analysis. Modern criminal investigations increasingly depend upon this type of evidence because digital communications often reveal planning, organization, and connections impossible to observe through physical evidence alone. In the Luka Sachai case, those records became one of the central reasons prosecutors moved away from the theory of a random robbery toward the conclusion that the violence occurred within the context of an alleged failed drug transaction. Yet despite the sophistication of modern investigative techniques, one aspect of the case remained remarkably simple. Every major legal argument, every appeal, every forensic examination, and every media discussion ultimately revolved around approximately 30 seconds of violence. 30 seconds during which Anastasia Kylemik was struck with a metal club. 30 seconds during which Luka Sachai turned back to help her. 30 seconds during which Valerio Del Grosso drew a handgun and fired a fatal shot. 30 seconds that permanently altered the lives of numerous families while generating years of legal proceedings and national debate. The contrast between the brevity of the attack and the length of its consequences is perhaps one of the most striking characteristics of the case. Violence often unfolds far more quickly than its aftermath. Decisions lasting only moments can produce legal proceedings extending across years and emotional consequences lasting a lifetime. The Luka Sachai case serves as a powerful example of that reality. It also demonstrates another important lesson frequently encountered in major criminal investigations: the difference between appearance and evidence. During the earliest stage of the case, appearances suggested one explanation. Evidence ultimately supported another. That distinction is fundamental not only within criminal justice, but within public understanding of crime itself. Headlines published during the first 24 hours after a major incident rarely contain every relevant fact because investigators themselves have not yet completed their work. As additional evidence emerges, earlier assumptions may require revision. The Luka Sachai investigation reminded both journalists and the public of the importance of allowing complex investigations the time necessary to reach evidence-based conclusions. At the same time, the case underscored the necessity of distinguishing between the actions of different individuals rather than treating every person connected to a tragedy as equally responsible. Throughout the judicial proceedings, the courts carefully evaluated the evidence concerning each defendant separately. Likewise, the courts made a specific finding regarding Luka himself, concluding that there was no evidence establishing that he had directly negotiated or organized the alleged drug purchase examined during the investigation. Instead, the evidence accepted by the court showed that he was fatally shot after intervening when Anastasia was attacked. That legal distinction remained one of the most significant conclusions reached throughout the years of litigation because it reflected the court's commitment to assigning responsibility according to proven evidence rather than speculation or association. Today, the Luka Sachai case continues to be discussed not only because of its tragic outcome, but because of the remarkable transformation of the investigation itself. It began as what appeared to be an ordinary street robbery and evolved into one of Italy's most closely followed homicide investigations, illustrating how patient police work, forensic analysis, surveillance technology, and digital evidence can fundamentally reshape the understanding of a crime. The case remains a reminder that truth in criminal investigations is rarely uncovered all at once. More often, it emerges gradually through careful examination of facts that initially appear unrelated. Each recovered object, each surveillance recording, each telephone record, and each witness statement became another piece of a larger puzzle until investigators were able to reconstruct the events with sufficient clarity for the courts to reach their final judgments. In the end, however, perhaps the most enduring memory should not be the complexity of the investigation, but the simplicity of what was lost. Luka Sachai was 24 years old. He left a neighborhood pub with his girlfriend after an ordinary evening in Rome. Less than 30 seconds later, he had suffered injuries from which he would never recover. The years that followed revealed hidden communications, disputed allegations, multiple defendants, and lengthy judicial proceedings. But none of those developments changed the central human reality at the heart of the case. A young life ended far too soon. A family was left to grieve. And a single act of violence forever altered the course of countless other lives. Cases like this remind us that behind every court file, every investigative report, and every headline lies a human story that extends far beyond the courtroom. Justice may establish accountability, but remembrance preserves humanity. And in remembering Luka Sachai, the focus should remain not on the notoriety of those who committed violent acts, but on the life that was irreversibly taken on an autumn night in Rome, a life whose final moments became part of one of Italy's most unforgettable criminal investigations. When people remember the Luka Sachai case today, they often remember it through two entirely different narratives. The first is the story that spread across Italy in the hours immediately following the shooting. A 24-year-old personal trainer killed while trying to protect his girlfriend during what appeared to be a violent street robbery. The second is the story that emerged only after investigators spent months examining surveillance footage, recovering physical evidence, analyzing phone records, and reconstructing events that had unfolded long before the fatal 30 seconds outside John Cabot Pub. These two narratives are not identical, yet both form part of the history of the case. One reflects how the tragedy was initially understood. The other reflects what the investigation ultimately concluded after the evidence had been carefully examined through multiple levels of the Italian judicial system. The contrast between those narratives explains why the case continues to be discussed years after. The Court of Cassation issued its final decision. It is remembered not simply because a young man lost his life, but because it demonstrated how dramatically the understanding of a crime can change when investigators refuse to stop at the first explanation. Modern criminal investigations often unfold in stages. The public sees the crime scene. Police officers see the evidence. Detectives begin asking questions that may seem insignificant at first. Prosecutors gradually assemble a broader picture. Judges evaluate every piece of evidence according to legal standards rather than public emotion. Only after all of those stages have been completed does the justice system reach conclusion. The Luka Sachai case followed precisely that path. The journey from apparent robbery to the prosecution's reconstruction of an alleged failed drug transaction was not the result of rumor or speculation, but of a gradual accumulation of evidence. Each new discovery forced investigators to reconsider assumptions that had seemed convincing only days earlier. That process illustrates one of the most important principles in criminal justice. Facts must guide conclusions, not the other way around. It is natural for the public to seek immediate answers after a shocking crime. People want certainty because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Yet certainty reached too quickly can become a barrier to discovering the truth. Had investigators accepted the original explanation without examining the recovered backpack, reviewing surveillance recordings, or analyzing communication records, the case might have ended very differently. Instead, they continued asking difficult questions, even when those questions challenged the narrative already embraced by the media and much of the public. The investigation became an example of why patience remains one of the most valuable qualities in law enforcement. Every piece of evidence must be tested against every other piece. Every statement must be compared with objective facts. Every inconsistency deserves attention, no matter how small it may initially appear. Sometimes a single unanswered question leads investigators toward an entirely different understanding of crime. In this case, one of those questions concerned a backpack. Another concerned surveillance footage showing repeated movements near the pub. Another emerged from hundreds of phone calls and messages exchanged before the shooting. Individually, none of those discoveries fully explained what had happened. Together, they transformed the direction of the investigation. The case also serves as a reminder of how rapidly violence can alter countless lives. According to the reconstruction accepted by the courts, approximately 30 seconds separated an ordinary evening from irreversible tragedy. 30 seconds was all it took for Anastasia Kylemek to be struck with a metal club, for Luca Sacchai to react instinctively, for Valerio Del Grosso to draw a handgun, and for a single shot to end the life of a 24-year-old man. Yet those same 30 seconds generated years of investigation, multiple criminal prosecutions, extensive media coverage, appeals through the Italian court system, and continuing public discussion long after the physical evidence had been collected. The imbalance between the speed of the crime and the duration of its consequences is striking. Human beings often spend years trying to understand events that unfolded in moments. Families spend lifetimes living with losses created in seconds. Courts devote thousands of pages of legal analysis to decisions made almost instantaneously. This is one of the enduring realities of violent crime. The act itself may be brief, but its consequences extend far beyond the moment when the violence ends. Another enduring lesson from the Luca Sacchai case concerns the role of evidence in separating emotion from legal responsibility. Public sympathy naturally centered on Luca after his death. At the same time, investigators and judges carried a different responsibility. Their task was not to confirm public expectations, but to establish the truth through admissible evidence. Throughout the proceedings, the courts carefully distinguished between allegations, proven facts, and legal conclusions. They evaluated each defendant separately, assigning responsibility according to evidence rather than assumption. They also reached a specific conclusion regarding Luca himself, determining that there was no evidence showing that he had directly negotiated or organized the alleged marijuana transaction examined during the investigation. Instead, the courts concluded that he was shot after intervening during the assault on Anastasia. That distinction reflected one of the central principles of justice. Guilt cannot be established through association alone. Every person's conduct must be evaluated independently and according to the available evidence. Although this principle may appear obvious, cases attracting widespread media attention often test society's ability to preserve it. The Luca Sacchai investigation demonstrated why that principle remains essential. The story also highlights the increasing importance of technology in contemporary criminal investigations. Surveillance cameras documented movements impossible to reconstruct through memory alone. Mobile phone records revealed communication patterns extending far beyond the visible crime scene, together with physical evidence recovered during the investigation. These tools allowed detectives to reconstruct events with a level of precision that would have been difficult to achieve in earlier decades. Technology, however, did not replace traditional investigative work. Detectives still interviewed witnesses, examined physical evidence, compared statements, and followed leads one by one. Technology provided information, but human investigators interpreted that information within the broader context of the case. The successful reconstruction of the events surrounding Luca Sacchai's death therefore reflected not only advances in forensic capability, but also careful investigative judgment. Perhaps the most meaningful reflection, however, lies outside the courtroom altogether. Criminal cases are often remembered by the names of the defendants, the complexity of the evidence, or the controversy surrounding the verdicts. Over time, those legal details can overshadow the individual whose death made the investigation necessary in the first place. It is worth remembering that before newspapers began publishing timelines, before prosecutors presented theories in court, and before judges issued lengthy decisions, Luca Sacchai was simply a young man living his everyday life in Rome. He worked as a personal trainer, He spent an evening with his girlfriend. He entered a neighborhood pub expecting nothing more extraordinary than a night with acquaintances. Those ordinary moments deserve to be remembered alongside the extraordinary investigation that followed. They remind us that victims are never merely names in legal documents. They are people whose futures end abruptly, leaving families, friends, and communities to confront an absence that no verdict can erase. Luca's family's decision to donate his organs after his death further reinforces that perspective. Amid unimaginable grief, they chose an act capable of helping others. It was a decision entirely separate from the criminal proceedings. It remains one of the most compassionate chapters in the story. While the investigation focused on determining responsibility for a violent crime, Luca's family demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity can still find expression through generosity and concern for others. In many ways, that decision represents a quiet counterbalance to the violence that ended his life. The Luca Sacchai case ultimately stands as more than a homicide investigation. It is a study in how truth emerges through evidence rather than assumption, how justice depends upon careful examination rather than immediate certainty, and how the consequences of violence extend far beyond the moment a crime occurs. It reminds us that every headline captures only the beginning of a much longer process. Behind every police cordon lies an investigation still unfolding. Behind every courtroom verdict lies years of work performed by detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges. And behind every legal file lies a human story defined not by procedures or evidence alone, but by the life that was lost. As this story comes to a close, the final lesson is perhaps the simplest. The first version of events is not always the final truth. Evidence deserves patience. Justice requires precision. And every victim deserves to be remembered not only for the circumstances of their death, but for the life they lived before tragedy transformed them into a headline. Luca Sacchai's name remains part of one of Italy's most significant criminal cases. But beyond the legal record, it also remains the name of a young man whose future ended on an autumn night in Rome, an ending that continues to remind us how fragile ordinary life can be, and how essential it is to pursue the truth with care, discipline, and respect for the facts. The story of Luca Sacchai did not end with the final court decision. Although the confirmation of the convictions in 2025 marked the conclusion of the judicial process, the questions raised by the case continued to remain part of public discussion in Italy. Some criminal cases disappear from public attention once a verdict is delivered. Others remain because they reveal something deeper about society, justice, human behavior, and the complicated ways in which truth emerges after a tragedy. The Luca Sacchai case belongs to the second category. It remains remembered not only because of the violence that occurred on a Roman street in October 2019, but because the understanding of that violence changed dramatically over time. What appeared to be one type of crime in the beginning became something far more complex after. Investigators examined the evidence. The transformation of the case from an apparent street robbery into an investigation involving an alleged failed drug transaction became one of the defining aspects of its legacy. At the center of everything, however, remained the same undeniable fact. A 24-year-old man lost his life in circumstances that unfolded with devastating speed. The years of investigation and trials created a detailed legal record, but they also demonstrated how difficult it can be to reconstruct the truth after a violent event. Crimes do not occur in isolation. They are the result of decisions made by individuals, relationships between people, communication that may happen before an event, and actions taken in moments of extreme tension. Investigators must work backward from the final outcome, examining every available piece of information to understand what led there. In Luca sa chiese case. The visible crime scene represented only the final stage of a much longer chain of events. The gunshot outside John Cabot pub was the moment that ended Luca's life. But investigators later argued that the circumstances leading to that moment had begun much earlier through communications, planning, and an alleged arrangement involving other individuals. This distinction between the visible act and the hidden background became the foundation of the investigation. It also explains why the case attracted such intense attention. The public initially believed the tragedy could be understood in simple terms. A young man killed by criminals during a robbery. When that explanation changed, many people were forced to reconsider not only the case itself, but also how quickly conclusions are often formed after shocking events. The evolution of the Luca Sacchai investigation demonstrated the importance of separating emotional reaction from factual determination. The first story people hear after a crime is often incomplete. It may be based on limited information available during the first hours or days, when investigators themselves are still trying to understand what happened. While early reports can be important in informing the public, they rarely contain the full picture. The Luca Sacchai case showed how a narrative can change when new evidence becomes available. Surveillance footage revealed movements that were not visible during the initial account. The recovered backpack raised questions that challenged the assumption of an ordinary robbery. Mobile phone records exposed connections and communications that changed the direction of the investigation. Each discovery did not simply add information. It altered the meaning of information that had already been known. This is one of the defining characteristics of complex criminal cases. Evidence does not always provide immediate answers. Sometimes, evidence creates new questions that investigators must follow until a clearer picture emerges. Another important aspect of the case was the distinction between Luca Sacchai as a victim and the broader circumstances investigated after his death. Because the investigation uncovered allegations of a drug transaction involving several individuals, public discussions sometimes became focused on the criminal environment surrounding the case. However, the courts made an important legal distinction. The evidence did not establish that Luca had directly negotiated or organized the alleged purchase of marijuana. The judicial findings focused instead on the fact that he was fatally shot after intervening when Anastasia was attacked. This conclusion preserved the difference between the actions of those accused of criminal conduct and the actions of the person who lost his life during the confrontation. In highly publicized cases, maintaining that distinction is essential because association does not automatically equal participation, and suspicion cannot replace proof. The justice system's role is to determine responsibility based on evidence, not simply on the surrounding circumstances. The legal outcome of the case also demonstrated the complexity of assigning responsibility in crimes involving multiple individuals. The courts examined the roles of each defendant individually. Valerio Del Grosso was identified as the person who fired the fatal shot. Paolo Perino was held responsible for his participation in the assault and the attempted seizure of the backpack. Marcelo de Propris was convicted based on his alleged role in providing the weapon used in the crime. Anastasia Kalimnik's legal responsibility was evaluated separately, resulting in a conviction related to drug law violations rather than homicide. These different outcomes reflected a fundamental principle of criminal justice. Not everyone connected to an event carries the same level of responsibility, and each person's actions must be evaluated according to the evidence against them. The case therefore became not only a story about a murder, but also an example of how courts attempt to measure individual responsibility within complicated circumstances. Beyond the legal arguments, the Luca Sacchai case also raised broader questions about the vulnerability of ordinary moments. One of the reasons the tragedy affected so many people was the contrast between the normality of the evening and the violence that followed. Luca and Anastasia were not in a location associated with danger. They were not expecting confrontation. They had simply spent time at a neighborhood pub before leaving. That ordinary beginning made the outcome even more difficult to comprehend. Many people can imagine themselves in similar situations, leaving a restaurant, walking home after meeting friends, or spending a quiet evening with someone close. The tragedy demonstrated how quickly an ordinary moment can become extraordinary and irreversible. This universal element contributed to the emotional impact of the case across Italy. It was not only the details of the investigation that captured attention, but also the reminder that violence can interrupt everyday life without warning. The case also highlighted the responsibility of media coverage when reporting on ongoing criminal investigations. The early portrayal of Luca as a young man killed while protecting his girlfriend reflected the information available at the time. But later developments showed that initial narratives can be incomplete. As the investigation changed direction, media outlets faced the challenge of reporting new information while acknowledging that previous assumptions had changed. Highly emotional cases create pressure for immediate explanations. Yet responsible reporting requires patience and accuracy. The Luca Sacchai case became an example of why complex investigations should be allowed to develop before final conclusions are drawn publicly. Facts discovered later may significantly alter the understanding of an event, and the pursuit of truth requires a willingness to revise earlier interpretations when new evidence appears. Perhaps the most lasting element of the case is the reminder that every criminal investigation ultimately concerns human lives. Legal documents contain charges, evidence, arguments, and sentences. They describe actions and responsibilities. But behind those documents are people affected forever by what happened. Luca's family experienced a loss that cannot be measured in legal terms. Friends lost someone they knew and cared about. A community was forced to confront the consequences of violence occurring in a familiar place. Even those who followed the case only through news reports encountered a story that challenged their assumptions about crime and justice. The investigation may have focused on answering questions of who, how, and why, but the emotional reality remained centered on a life that ended too soon. The decision by Luca's family to donate his organs after his death remains one of the most meaningful parts of the story because it shifted attention from violence toward compassion. In a case dominated by accusations, criminal plans, and betrayal, that decision represented something entirely different. It demonstrated generosity during a moment of unbearable pain. It showed that even when a person becomes the victim of a violent crime, the final chapter of their story does not have to be defined only by what was taken away. It can also include what was given to others. Years after the shooting, the Luca Sacchai case remains a reminder of several important truths. Investigations require patience because appearances can be misleading. Evidence must be examined carefully because assumptions can obscure reality. Courts must separate emotion from legal responsibility because justice depends on proof. And behind every criminal case is a human being whose life existed before the tragedy that brought their name into public attention. Luca Sacchai was not only the victim in a widely followed homicide investigation. He was a 24-year-old man with a profession, relationships, family, and a future that ended unexpectedly. Remembering that fact is essential because criminal cases are ultimately about more than crimes themselves. They are about the people affected by those crimes. The investigation into Luca's death revealed a complicated chain of events involving multiple individuals and years of legal proceedings. But beyond the evidence, verdicts, and headlines, the most important conclusion remains simple. A life was lost, and that loss cannot be undone. The pursuit of justice provided answers about responsibility, but remembrance provides meaning. The legacy of Luka Sachai's case lies not only in understanding what happened on the night of October 23, 2019, but also in recognizing the importance of truth, fairness, and compassion when confronting tragedy. His story remains a powerful example of why every victim deserves to be remembered, not merely through the circumstances of their death, but through the value of the life they lived before that moment changed everything. In the years following the death of Luka Sachai, the case gradually moved from the urgency of breaking news into the slower, more permanent space of public memory. The investigation ended, the trials concluded, and the courts delivered their final decisions. But the questions surrounding the tragedy continued to influence how people understood the case. Some remembered it as one of the most controversial criminal investigations in modern Italy. Others remembered it as the story of a young man whose life ended during a moment of sudden violence. For Luca's family and those who knew him personally, however, the case was never only about evidence, defendants, or courtroom arguments. It was about a person whose absence became part of their daily lives. Behind every page of legal documents and every televised discussion was the reality that a 24-year-old man was no longer able to experience the future that once awaited him. The passage of time often changes the way society remembers major criminal cases. In the immediate aftermath of a tragedy, attention focuses on shock, uncertainty, and the search for answers. Later, as investigations conclude and media coverage decreases, the public begins to see the larger meaning of what happened. The Luka Sachai case followed this pattern. At first, Italy reacted to the image of a young man killed while apparently defending his girlfriend. Then, as investigators uncovered additional evidence, the story became more complicated. Finally, after years of legal proceedings, the case became a broader reflection on how truth is discovered, how responsibility is determined, and how victims should be remembered. One of the most significant aspects of the case was the contrast between the simplicity of the moment itself and the complexity of everything that followed. The physical confrontation lasted only a short period of time. According to the reconstruction accepted by investigators and the courts, the attack outside John Cabot Pub unfolded in approximately 30 seconds. In that brief interval, Anastasia Kylemik was attacked, Luka reacted, and a single gunshot changed multiple lives forever. Yet understanding why that moment occurred required years of investigation. Police had to examine movements, communications, relationships, and evidence that existed far beyond the immediate crime scene. Prosecutors had to present a reconstruction capable of explaining not only what happened, but why it happened. Courts had to evaluate the evidence carefully and determine the responsibility of each person involved. This contrast between the speed of violence and the length of justice is one of the most difficult realities of criminal cases. A crime may occur in seconds, but the consequences can continue for decades. Families carry grief long after courtrooms become silent. Communities remember places where tragedies occurred. Investigators continue reviewing details until every possible question has been addressed. The Luka Sachai case represented this reality clearly. A single moment outside a Roman pub created years of legal proceedings and left behind questions that extended far beyond the night itself. The case also demonstrated how fragile first impressions can be. When the first reports emerged, the explanation appeared clear. Two criminals had allegedly attempted to steal a backpack. Luka had intervened, and he had been killed as a result. This interpretation was understandable based on the information available at the time. However, the later investigation showed that crimes are rarely as simple as they first appear. The recovered backpack, which still contained personal documents and more than 2,000 euros, created doubts about the original robbery theory. Surveillance footage showing the suspect's movements near the pub suggested preparation. Mobile phone analysis revealed communication between individuals connected to the alleged transaction. These discoveries changed the direction of the investigation and demonstrated why law enforcement must continue searching even when an initial explanation appears convincing. The evolution of the Lucas Sachai case also highlighted the difference between public perception and judicial conclusions. Public opinion often seeks a clear narrative, heroes and criminals, victims and perpetrators, right and wrong. Real criminal investigations, however, are usually more complicated. They involve evidence, uncertainty, competing explanations, and legal standards that must be applied carefully. The courts examining Luca's death were not responsible for confirming the most emotionally satisfying version of events. Their responsibility was to determine what could be proven. This distinction shaped the final outcome of the case. The judgments delivered through the Italian legal system reflected this careful approach. Valerio Del Grosso was held responsible as the person who fired the fatal shot. Paolo Perino was convicted for his role in the assault and attempted robbery. Marcello De Propris was convicted for his involvement in providing the weapon used in the crime. Anastasia Kylemnik received a separate conviction related to violations of drug laws, but was not convicted of homicide. These different outcomes reflected the court's assessment that each person's role had to be considered individually. Perhaps the most important judicial conclusion concerned Luca himself. Despite the investigation into an alleged drug transaction involving several individuals, the courts did not establish that Luca had directly negotiated or organized the purchase of marijuana. This point remained essential because it prevented the circumstances surrounding the case from changing the identity of the victim. Luca was not defined by the allegations involving others. According to the court findings, he was the person who lost his life after responding to an attack against his girlfriend. His final action was a reaction to violence unfolding in front of him, not evidence of participation in the criminal activity examined during the investigation. This distinction matters because victims in high-profile cases can sometimes become overshadowed by the controversy surrounding the crime. As investigators uncover complicated details, public attention can shift toward the surrounding circumstances rather than the individual who suffered the greatest loss. The Luca Sachai case experienced this tension. Discussions about the alleged drug transaction, the suspects, and the legal arguments sometimes risked moving attention away from the central human tragedy. Remembering Luca requires acknowledging the full context of the case while also recognizing that he was a person whose life had value beyond the circumstances of his death. Before he became the subject of national headlines, Luca Sachai was a young man living his everyday life in Rome. He worked as a personal trainer and was known within his local fitness community. He had relationships with family and friends. He had ordinary routines, personal goals, and a future that was never allowed to unfold. These details may appear simple, but they are precisely what make victims real. A person is not defined only by the final moments of their life. The years before tragedy are equally important because they reveal the person who existed beyond the crime. The decision by Luca's family to donate his organs after his death remains one of the most meaningful elements of the story because it reflected compassion during an unimaginable moment of suffering. While the criminal investigation focused on violence and responsibility, the choice made by his family represented something entirely different, an effort to create something positive from a devastating loss. It was a reminder that even after a violent act takes away a life, the values of that person and the choices made by those who love them can still have an impact. The legacy of the Luca Sachai case is therefore not limited to the details of the investigation. It is also found in the questions the case raises about how society responds to crime. How quickly should conclusions be reached? How should media report on developing investigations? How can justice balance public emotion with legal precision? How should victims be remembered when the circumstances surrounding their deaths become complicated? These questions extend beyond one individual case. They are part of the broader challenge of understanding crime in a responsible and humane way. The investigation showed that truth is often not discovered through one dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of facts. A surveillance recording, a recovered object, a phone record, a witness statement. Each piece contributed to a larger picture. No single element alone explained everything. Together, they allowed investigators and courts to reconstruct the events surrounding Luca's death. This process serves as a reminder that justice depends not on assumptions, but on careful examination. At the same time, the case demonstrated the limits of justice. Courts can determine responsibility. They can impose sentences. They can establish a legal record of what happened. But they cannot reverse the consequences of violence. They cannot return Luca to his family. They cannot erase the pain experienced by those who lost him. A verdict can provide accountability, but it cannot provide restoration. For this reason, the final memory of Luca Sacchai should not be limited to the circumstances of October 23, 2019. It should include the person he was before that night. It should include the family who chose generosity even while grieving. It should include the investigators who worked to uncover the truth and a legal system that examined the evidence over years of proceedings. The case was defined by tragedy, but it also revealed moments of courage, responsibility, and humanity. Ultimately, the story of Luca Sacchai is a reminder that behind every criminal case is a human life. Behind every investigation is a family waiting for answers. Behind every courtroom decision is a loss that cannot be measured only through legal language. The final chapter of this case is not simply about the sentences imposed or the evidence presented. It is about remembering that a young man's life mattered before he became a victim. Luca Sacchai's name remains connected to one of Italy's most closely followed criminal investigations of recent years. But beyond the controversy, beyond the accusations, and beyond the courtroom debates, his story remains fundamentally human. It is the story of an ordinary evening that became an extraordinary tragedy, of a family forced to live with an irreversible loss, and of a justice system that spent years searching for the truth. The investigation may have ended, but remembrance continues. And perhaps the most important lesson left behind is this: every victim deserves to be seen as more than the circumstances that ended their life. Every name in a criminal case represents a person who once had dreams, relationships, and a future. Luca Sacchai was one of those people. His story remains not only a record of a crime, but also a reminder of the value of a life lost too soon.